Welcome to the Investing Podcast presented by Tusk Media. This is Outsider Trading, an audio and video deep dive into the people, places, and things that we find most interesting in the market.
Hi, thanks for joining us today. I'm Ben Nye. I'm joined today by Chris Annunzio.
Hey guys.
And today we're doing another series. This one is going to focus on healthcare and the state of American healthcare. We've previously done ones on Bitcoin, and we do an interview series periodically. Our last episode was an interview where I sat down with the CIO of Atlanta Wealth Group, name of Greg Silberman. He's South African. We talked a lot about emerging markets. I would encourage you to check that out to the extent that you have time. But today we wanted to talk about healthcare costs, and specifically we want to dive into a big report put out by the Journal of the American Medical Association that came out on Monday night. And this had to do with the cost of American healthcare versus the outcomes that it has. And then it also looked at what are the real drivers of these increased costs. And what we found was that there was a lot that was not in the public's mainstream eye. When we talk about healthcare costs, sometimes we say, we have way higher costs than other countries, but that is because the other countries have single payer and they're really able to drive down costs because it's more of that social structure. So to our view, it would sound like those other countries have a higher percentage of their GDP being spent on social welfare programs like healthcare. What's interesting, though, and we'll dive into this on the data, is that as a percentage of GDP, among the countries surveyed, which includes Japan, Germany, UK, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Switzerland, and Sweden and Denmark, the U.S. actually spends about the same in terms of social health care, public health care, as all those other countries. They pay about 8.3%. These other countries pay on average 8.4%. However, on the whole, healthcare costs as a percentage of gross domestic product in the United States is 17.8% versus an average of 11.5%. So we're paying almost double what these other countries are paying. And the reason we're doing that is because not only are we also spending the same amount that those other countries spend on public health care, but then we have this private health care on top of that, which gets us just to about the same quality health care that these other countries have. Any thoughts on that? Just starting out, introductory thoughts, Chris?
Yeah, so, over at Kennesaw, I did a couple marketing projects, and one of the most interesting things that I've learned so far, it came from a service marketing course, and it was that healthcare was actually the number one largest industry and the number one most growing industries in American economy right now. And so I think these numbers are playing into that a bit.
And it's just incredible. For every $10 the American economy produces, $1.78 of that is just going to healthcare. That puts us at an immediate disadvantage versus other countries who are only spending $1.10, which means they have 60 cents to play with to invest in their infrastructure, to invest in their people, to invest in education, that Americans don't have because we're spending that on healthcare. So there's a difference between that. Now we're going to start talking about some of the reasons for that or some of the myths behind that, and then we'll kind of go into what's actually happening behind the scenes. Because there are a lot of myths that we want to expose today based on the data that we have from this survey. And probably first and foremost is that Americans have better health care than the rest of the world, especially the rest of the rich countries. And that would be because, we're actually paying for the healthcare. Private citizens can actually determine what healthcare is best for them, and they are able to think about that in ways that are most beneficial to them. Mm-hmm. While that may be true, the numbers don't bear that out. So if we were just to look at the health of the population in general, because that's often cited as a reason for inferior life expectancies in the United States. Americans actually don't have that worse lifestyles than other countries. Our lifestyle practices actually aren't as inferior as it's made out to be frequently. So if we look at the data, 11% of the population smokes, but that compares to 16% on average. We drink about 8.8 liters of alcohol a year. That compares to 9.1 liters on average. And out of every 100 people, about 70 are obese, compared to about a 56 average. So that might be a little bit more significant difference, but that's heavily skewed by Japan. And the Japan number is only 23 people are obese out of every 100.
Right.
If you look at Australia and the UK, you're talking about 63, and Canada and Germany are both 60. So again, we're a little fatter than the rest of the world.
Sure,
but
portions play a big part in that.
Right, but we drink a little bit less, we smoke a lot less. So I would probably argue that those might even out. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, just when you said that we're fatter, I guess in general, I think portion sizes play a big part into that. And the number one killer in America is was it heart disease? So I think that might be one of the areas that doesn't get talked about a lot. And on top of that, you mentioned that we drink less. I think the way we consume alcohol might be a problem too, because I know, I have a lot of buddies that binge drink, and that might be part of the problem, where you get your hands on alcohol at a young age and you're exploring with it. And you have a tendency to binge drink just because you've never been exposed to it before, as compared to other countries where I guess maybe they look at alcohol a little differently, and you're able to drink at a younger age, and it makes a difference.
So while average consumption might be lower, the peaks and valleys are more extreme.
Yeah.
Which could help explain some of the inferior health statistics that we're about to talk about. But again, I want you to keep in mind the fact that we spend 17.8% of GDP on healthcare, and the rest of the world spends 11.5%. So as we look into a lot of these causes, we want to say, we may be a little bit fatter, we may drink in more fits and starts than the rest of the world, but does that really explain almost double healthcare costs in the United States versus the rest of the world? So if we look at some of the outcomes, if we look at, for instance, life expectancy, our life expectancy at birth in the United States is 78.8. The world at large is the rest of these countries surveyed is 81.7. So we're living 3 years shorter. Part of that is due to the fact that we have a higher infant mortality rate, which is crazy because we pay our doctors the most by far of any other countries surveyed, higher by 60, 70% than these other countries, and yet we have higher infant mortality rates. We have higher neonatal mortality rates, 4 per 1,000 versus an average of 2.6. We have higher maternal mortality rates, 26.4 per 100,000 live births versus an average of 8.4. Almost triple the rate of maternal mortality per every live birth. So, and then if you look at it, but it's not just the newborns as well. It's not just the risk related to pregnancy. It's also the risk related to old age. Life expectancy at age 40 is 2 to 3 years less for males and females in the United States than it is for the rest of the countries surveyed. And in all of these, we're not talking about one country that skews the results up. Mm-hmm. We are lowest. Like out of the 10 or 11 countries surveyed, we are the lowest. So not only are we significantly below average, but we're also consistently the worst.
Yeah, that's a tough pill to swallow.
I mean, it's an expensive pill to swallow too. Yeah, and the last statistic I just want to throw out there is that we talked about lifestyle in general. The Journal of American Medical Association actually adjusts for lifestyle. And so if you look at the health-adjusted life expectancy at birth, we're at 69.1 versus the average among the countries surveyed of 72 even. So again, we're seeing a 3-year delta between life expectancy for Americans and life expectancy for the rest of the country surveyed. And by the way, I think that Americans tend to be, and this is just anecdotal, but Americans tend to be a little bit more conservative when it comes to end-of-life practices. We tend to keep people alive longer versus European countries, and the stories you hear about the socialized medicine there, cutting the power, and stopping the breathing.
And I think part of that really makes sense because if you're having taxpayers, fund this guy who may or may not come out of a coma or whatever, extreme situation they're in, then that could add up, and it doesn't really affect one family so much as it does the entire country.
And the point here is that even with that, Americans are still living 3 years less. So, and again, 17.8% of GDP versus 11.5% GDP. So we're spending a ton more and living less. The next thing we want to talk about is access to care, because you hear these horror stories about going to Canada and not being able to see a doctor for months, or going to the UK and not being able to see a doctor for months, or not being able to see a specialist. Some of that is true, but not to the extent it's portrayed to be. For instance, in the United States, 51% of people are able to get an appointment the same day or the next day, which is pretty good, and probably you would think higher than the rest of the world. Not the case. Other countries, 57% on average are able to see a physician the same day or the next day. Where you get into the discrepancy is when you talk about seeing a specialist. For 6% of the American population, they have to wait 2 months to see a specialist, 2 months or more. For the rest of the world, for the other rich countries, it's 13%. So we're able to see a specialist a little bit sooner, but we're able to see a doctor. Actually, it takes longer time to just see kind of your family practice doctor.
Right.
So I think the point from that is that we actually don't have better access to physicians at large. Maybe a little bit easier access to see a specialist, but probably not physicians at large. So another cause that's been cited in terms of access is that we just use more tests in the United States. We're over-tested. Doctors are nervous about missing a diagnosis, so they'll just order the nth test, bill the insurance company, bill Medicare, and go from there. You're not really seeing the money. It just comes out of the taxpayer fund or your insurance company, so it's not a big deal for the doctor.
Do you think part of that is because they're trying to avoid liabilities, or?
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of it. But then if you look at the statistics, we actually don't order that many more tests than the rest of the world. For example, if you look at the not tests, procedures, hip replacements in the United States, 204 per 100,000 people versus an average of 207. So we're right in line. That's hip replacement. Knee replacements, maybe this goes with the more overweight population. We're at 226 versus an average of 163. So maybe a little bit more. But again, that's only a 60 increase out of every 100,000 people. Does that explain that 17.8% number versus 11.5% number? I don't think so. Hysterectomy, we're right in line. Coronary angioplasty, we're 248 versus an average of 217. So maybe we do few more tests than the rest of the world. So to say that increased usage of tests is responsible for that increased cost, I think is hyperbole. And even if that was the case, it's not resulting in better life expectancy. So take that for what you will, but the fact of the matter is I don't think we're getting better quality for what we're paying.
Thanks, Ben and Chris, for going over those numbers. This is part one of a two-part special episode. Part two will dive into the reasons behind these higher costs in the United States relative to the other 10 countries in this report. Check back in with us on Seeking Alpha for the conclusion of our healthcare analysis. Thanks for joining us.
Tusk Media is a subsidiary of Narwhal Capital Management. Ratings and reviews of Tusk Media content are not to be construed as endorsements of opinions, analysis, or services offered by Tusk or its parent company. The opinions and predictions shared here are our professional beliefs at the time of publication. We are not under duress from any of the corporate entities mentioned. This is not a solicitation to take any particular action. Although we are investment advisors, this information should not be considered investment, legal, or tax advice. We strive to be as impartial, insightful, and accurate as possible. We base our opinions, analysis, and calculations on information we believe to be reliable, but we cannot guarantee its accuracy. We can, however, guarantee that our opinions will sometimes be flat out wrong due to a variety of factors. Employees and clients of Narwhal Capital Management may or may not hold positions in the securities detailed and may or may not hold these positions in the future. A full list of all securities purchased, sold, or held during the 12 months preceding the date of this publication can be provided upon request. Unless otherwise noted, all data accessed via MarketWatch or the Bloomberg terminal. Past performance does not guarantee future results. A copy of Narwhal's Form ADV is available at the SEC's website, www.advisorinfo.sec.gov, or from Narwhal upon written request.